Today I am talking about salt. Now, I want to focus on different types of salt. But first, what is salt? Okay, let's start with some example. There are many salts. Just for example, potassium chloride. In the same way, sodium chloride. There are other also magnesium, not only chloride. There is carbonate also. And calcium, there is not only carbonate, sulfate also, chloride, sulfate, carbonate, bicarbonate, etc. Whenever they combine with a metal, then they form salt. But this is not the definition of salt. How can we define salt? Salt can be defined in different ways, but one of the popular method of definition or very common method of definition of salt is this way. Salt is a compound which forms by the partial or complete replacement of hydrogen contained in an acid by a metal or basic radical. Okay, I want to talk about this in a little detail. Just for example, this is sodium sulfate. Let's talk about sodium sulfate. This sodium sulfate is a salt. And how it is formed? It is assumed that it is formed from the sulfuric acid H2SO4. This sulfuric acid contains hydrogen, and when this hydrogen is completely displaced by the sodium, a metal sodium, then what is formed? Sodium sulfate. This way, how do we define salt? We can define salt this way. Salt is a compound which forms by the partial or complete replacement of the hydrogen contained in an acid by a metal or basic radical. This metal is also called basic radical. The radical which comes from base is called basic radical. Just for example, from sodium hydroxide, sodium comes. This is base, and sodium comes from sodium hydroxide. That's why if this hydrogen is displaced by sodium, this is called hydrogen is displaced by basic radical. Okay, this is the common definition of salt. Now we'll talk in detail also. Sometimes what happens, this hydrogen is not completely displaced. Maybe one atom of hydrogen is displaced by sodium and it forms NaHSO4, sodium bisulfate. This is also salt. That's why either the hydrogen is completely displaced or the hydrogen is partially displaced, whatever it is, but they form salt. Okay, this is the definition of salt. Now I want to mention there are four basic types of salt. We can say that there are four types of salt. They are: number one, acidic salt, and number two, basic salt, and number three, neutral salt, and number four, hydrated salt. Let's talk about them in detail. I mean to say, just the introduction I want to give you, and detail cannot be taken in this small class. We'll talk in detail about other classes. Acidic salt. What is it? Exactly. We can define acidic salt like this: a salt formed by the partial displacement of hydrogen from an acid by a metal or basic radical. Just before this, I told you about this sodium bisulfate. Actually, in sodium, this sodium bisulfate is formed by the reaction of, we can assume that it is formed by the reaction of sodium hydroxide and sulfuric acid H2SO4. And we can say that if this hydrogen is partially displaced by sodium, then what forms? Sodium bisulfate forms. And here hydrogen is not completely displaced. This way, if any salt forms, then that is called acidic salt. Now let's talk about basic salt. Look at this. A salt formed by the partial displacement of hydroxide from a base by a non-metallic or acidic radical is called basic salt. Acidic radical means the radical which comes from acid is called acidic radical. Just for example, from hydrochloric acid, chlorine if comes, this is called acidic radical. In the same way, from sulfuric acid, if sulfate is taken, then that is called what? Acidic salt. And our definition says that a salt is formed by the partial displacement of hydroxide from a base by a non-metal or acidic radical is called basic salt. We can take one example of this. Just for example, this if we have let's say copper copper hydroxide. This is a base, and from this base, if hydroxyl is displaced, and if copper CuOS, and if it is reacting with nitric acid SNO3, and if this hydroxide is partially displaced by this nitrate radical, then it forms what? This compound. And in this compound, hydroxyl is partially displaced and a salt is formed, and that's why this is called a basic salt. Now let's talk about neutral salt. What is neutral salt? Neutral salt can be defined this way: a salt formed by the complete displacement of hydrogen from an acid by a metal or basic radical is called neutral salt. Now we can take an example of neutral salt like this. If this hydrochloric acid reacts with sodium hydroxide, we are not writing exactly complete reaction, we are just talking about the salt only. The method of formation of salt and chemical reaction we'll talk later. Okay, in this reaction, if this hydrogen is completely replaced by this sodium, then sodium chloride forms. There is another product also, water. This sodium chloride is formed by the complete replacement of this hydrogen. Let's take sulfuric acid. If this hydrogen is completely replaced or displaced by copper, then copper sulfate forms. Then this is called neutral salt. A salt which is formed by the complete displacement of hydrogen from an acid by a metal or basic radical is called neutral salt. Okay. Now after this, I want to talk about this hydrated salt. This can be taken as the definition of hydrated salt. A salt made up of crystalline salt molecules that is loosely attached to the definite number of water molecule is called hydrated salt. Okay, what it means? Just for example, I think you have seen this type of molecular formula of calcium sulfate. Calcium sulfate dot 7s2o, and we generally say that this is calcium sulfate. It is obtained in the form of crystalline shape, geometrical shape, having sharp edges. This is actually hydrated salt. This is called water of crystallization. One molecule of calcium sulfate is attached with 7 molecules of water. In the same way, this another salt I want to take here example of Na2CO3. This is just sodium carbonate, but this sodium carbonate is normally attached with 10 molecules of water, and this is available in the form of what? Crystal. And this is called hydrated salt because water molecules are attached with the molecule of sodium carbonate. The other also, just for example, zinc sulfate. Zinc sulfate is attached with 7 molecules of water. This is another hydrated salt. This way, water molecules are attached. If attached with the water, if attached with the salt, then that is called hydrated salt. This is also called water of crystallization. And thus we can define four basic types of salt: acidic salt, basic salt, neutral salt, and hydrated salt. Okay, this much for today.